Hi, and welcome to the Keys to Therapy. Today's guest is Laura talking about ACT therapy. Hi, Laura. Welcome.
Hi, so nice to be here with you today.
Yes, I'm happy it's finally happening. I've been wanting to get Laura on my channel for a bit, and now she's here. So, yay.
Yay.
Well, do you want to tell the audience a little bit about you, who you are, and what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm an online therapist. I live in Wilmington, North Carolina, but I see clients virtually in all throughout North Carolina, but also I'm licensed in Maryland. I am a clinical social worker. Um, I primarily work with the high achieving, anxious, stressed out, and overwhelmed professional women. And that's kind of always been my jam, my go-to. I get it. So that's why I really enjoy working with them. And then I also recently started a business coaching for introverts who are in solo practice. So that's been really fun to kind of like dive into as well.
Yeah, I love that though, because I don't really know of any services for introverts specifically. And I think a lot of people think when you're a therapist, you talk to people all day, you have to be extroverted, but that's not true.
Yeah, right? Like it's especially like in the business that we're in, like,
Mhm.
being therapists and whatnot, like, not all of us, but definitely some of us, like, we do a lot of like hard work. We are putting ourselves out there like all the time. So, like, those of us who are introverted, and practice owners, like, it can be a lot. So, I just think it's really awesome to like kind of focus in on that. I'm an introvert myself and kind of like working my way through the business world and like creating my practice and things like that. Like I saw, practice owners who were doing things and I was like, yes, that's like great for you. And like that's not exactly like how I want to do things or like how I feel comfortable doing things.
Yeah.
So trying to be more like authentic and aligned. Yeah.
I love that because there's so many different ways to be in this profession. And I think
Hmm.
sometimes, it's like we see one version of a therapist and it feels like that's how
Hmm.
everybody has to be. And a lot of times when people are trying to put themselves in a box that doesn't fit them, they're starting out their careers not aligned,
Yes.
feeling like an imposter for sure, because you're pretending. So,
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Right. Like mindset stuff is a huge part of it for
mhm.
especially for us introverts, like huge part. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mhm.
Well,
Yeah.
what made you decide to become a therapist then?
Oh man. Um, like looking back, I was always kind of that like helper kid and I feel like sort of in tune to other people. And so, growing up it was like, oh, maybe I'll be like a teacher, maybe, like something or like along the lines. And somehow I stumbled across social work and doing like um I don't want to say like doing therapy because I don't think I was ever really like, oh yeah, therapy.
Mhm.
But I thought the social work, um, what's the word I'm looking for? Like that profession like was so diverse that you could do like so many different things
Yeah.
that it wasn't just therapy. And so I was like really like pulled into that and then just kind of like enjoyed it, fell in love with it. I went to a great school that helped a lot. So I kind of just like went in that direction. And then, like life stuff, we all have things. And so I think just naturally kind of like falling into being a helper
Mhm.
and whatnot, like it just it just meshed.
Yeah, just came together. And now look at you.
Ah.
Yeah, but I love that everybody's paths are a little bit different, because some people, like I
Mhm.
knew pretty early on, I don't know, I can't remember exactly, but I know definitely like early high school, being like, I'm gonna be a therapist. I'm gonna have my own office. I'm gonna do this.
Ah.
So because I was
Oh.
already low key doing it in like chemistry class. And so like I was like, I'm already doing it. Let me go get like actually trained in it. So yeah. But
Oh,
I
that's
think for other
great.
people, it's like it sounds like for you it was broad. It was like, I know I want to help
Mhm.
people. Like let's keep narrowing in on how to do that until you found
Mhm.
what's fit for you.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I remember like my school, like how I did school, like after I graduated high school, like girl, I was like, let me try this, let me try that, let me try, which kind of now I understand as it works into my like manifesting generator self.
Yeah.
But we settled and it's all good. And now
Yeah.
it's just a bit more focused.
Exactly. And even then you're like, let's look at some coaching over here. Let's look at some other things, which is
Hmm.
cool because you can still like have the solid profession and branch out into different things. So I like that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Makes it more exciting.
Yeah. And so kind
Hmm.
of along those lines, I know for me personally, for school, like in grad school, they talked about some theories of practicing, but honestly, a lot of them were old and they weren't necessarily like very applicable to things now.
Yeah.
And there was more, it was more of like the history than it was actually like, how do you sit here and use these things or do these things? And a lot of them, like I said, were sort of outdated to me. So,
Hmm.
or too broad. So, acceptance and commitment therapy, that's something I don't know anything about. So,
Yeah.
I'm excited for you to talk about it today because I feel like I'm going to learn something and I'm like nerdy. So, I'm like, oh, like teach me all the things. So, I'm like selfishly doing this episode for myself so I can learn some stuff. But
Yeah.
if I didn't hear about it until recently, I feel like a lot of other people are probably in the same boat. So, if you
Hmm.
can explain what it is.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I'm kind of very similar. Like, I remember being in grad school and even undergrad, and like things were kind of like touched on like here and there.
Mhm.
But I think at the time they were really just like pushing like CBT, like hardcore, at
Mhm.
least in my undergrad program. And then I think when I got to grad school, no lie, like I must have just been like somewhere else that day that they talked about like these clinical models and theories and things like that because I really don't remember a whole lot of that.
If it even happened at
So
all.
right, yes.
Mhm.
So it really wasn't until a little bit later on that I discovered acceptance and commitment therapy. My background is I did a lot of trauma work coming out of
Mhm.
grad school. And so um, I didn't necessarily fall into like a pathway of like this is the model that I'm going to use and kind of be guided by, right? Um, and so it wasn't until like later on that I think I was doing some like CEUs and I was like, okay, like this one looks good,
Mhm.
let's check it out. And it was about acceptance and commitment therapy. And for whatever reason, like it just kind of like clicked for me. And I was like, this makes sense.
Mm.
Um, I've been trained in EMDR and I wasn't a huge fan. I wholeheartedly believe in it,
Yeah.
but in terms of like me um,
Mhm.
providing that for my clients and like practicing and things like that, like it just didn't click with me.
Mhm.
And I just continuously like gravitated back towards acceptance and commitment therapy, honestly. Um, so ACT is a type of behavioral therapy. It's called ACT for short, by the way.
Mm.
So it's a type of behavioral therapy, and it's considered to be like third wave.
Mm.
And it's really kind of like a cousin of CBT, but there are
Okay.
some differences with it. Um, and mainly a huge difference is that it really is based on like bringing in a lot of like mindfulness practice. And
Mm.
this idea, like the main objective is really to develop what they call like psychological flexibility. And so, it's not necessarily doing a bunch of like reframing and, of the thoughts and things like that, but more along the lines of like the thoughts that are showing up and like feelings that are showing up, like how do we lean into like accepting some of those things and working with what we've got and like changing the relationship with those things because a lot of times, right, like especially because I work with anxiety, like there's a lot
Yeah.
of like avoidance that comes into play. And so when there's like like yucky feelings or things like that that we're like, ooh, this is showing up like I don't want any parts of that. Like let me avoid. Da, da, da,
Mhm.
da. It's about leaning into some of those things and ultimately like how do I work with that? Like, it doesn't just because I'm experiencing this thing or just because this thought is like showing up doesn't necessarily mean it's like quote unquote bad, but like, how do I learn to lean in and accept and like move forward with it rather than, trying to do things to like restructure or like continue avoid or whatever. So, that's the main objective is just to develop this like psychological flexibility.
Hmm.
So, um, there are 6 core processes that come up to, like, help develop this psychological flexibility, and one of them I already mentioned, which is contacting the present moment, and so it's all about just, like, being mindful, being present in the here and now,
Okay.
um, because when ultimately, like, when we are more present, we can work to choose how we would like to respond versus how we react to things. Because when we're not present, a lot of times, like, we go about our day, and if something happens, we're just kind of like quick to react to it,
Hmm.
right? And sometimes that can get us into trouble, and take us in some not so like great places. But if we can be present, be aware, notice what's going on for us, right? Like we can choose a bit more like how we want to respond to this.
Hmm.
Like I don't want to fly off the handle at my partner
Yeah.
and like say unkind things, right? Even though my feelings might be hurt. And like maybe it's I, you know, sit with this, notice the feelings that are showing up, notice the thoughts that are showing up, and like how can I use some of the tools that I have um, to respond in a different way? And maybe that's like I take a break. I like communicate with my partner like after that break and say, you know what, like this was my experience and like how can we do things differently or like what, you know, kind of that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Um so like I'm very upfront with folks when they come in for the therapy process with me and start with me. I'm super upfront about that mindfulness is a huge part of the work that we do together because it kind of lays the foundation for like all the other things. Because if
Hmm.
we're not aware and present in what's going on, then it's kind of hard to do all the other stuff.
Right.
So generally, like when we start doing work together, that's where we start. Like I'm laying the foundation there and we weave it in throughout, like we do some formal practices, some spur of the moment things, but it's real. It's I enjoy it, and I notice it for myself. That's another thing. Side note here, when
Hmm.
it comes to doing act work, is that they talk a lot about like you can't just teach it, like it has to be very experiential,
Hmm.
um, and that in order to do like some good work with your clients, that you really need to be doing it for yourself.
Mm.
So a lot of times it's kind of like I'm doing it with the client, like leading them through things, but also like I'll notice myself like in sessions or even like outside day-to-day stuff, where like I've really kind of strengthened that mindfulness like muscle and trying to be present. Not all the time. Nobody's perfect, and
Yeah.
like it's impossible to be there 24/7. But I think it's one of the strengths, of doing the work is that it like kind of forces me to
Hmm.
have to do it too. So
Yeah.
I
But then
love
I'm
that.
sure when you're teaching it, it's coming across more authentically because you
Hmm.
actually do it. Right. So
Yeah.
I feel
Yeah.
like that's a big thing where a lot of times, you like go to the doctor and they're like, don't do this or do that, whatever. But then like when you pulled up, they were in the back smoking a cigarette. You're like, okay, like sure. Like it's hard to
Yes.
like fully take advice
Hmm.
and suggestions from somebody that you don't truly believe is actually doing the work. But
Hmm.
I feel like because it sounds like the type of modality that you have to practice, you probably
Hmm.
also would have like more tips even on
Yes.
how to implement it because you've
Mhm.
figured things out yourself.
Mhm. Right? Yeah, or like the possibility of like what could show up and like how to work through, like that challenge or whatnot. So yeah, absolutely. Like I'm not just over here being like, okay, here you go. Like been doing it myself too. So
Yeah.
that's really nice.
Hmm.
Yeah. So, a few of the other processes include like cognitive diffusion, where we're lessening our attachment to our thoughts, recognizing that just because a thought shows up in your mind doesn't necessarily make it true,
Mm.
that it's about how does this, um, rather than form, in act work, we go with function. And really what that means is like how is when that thought is showing up, or sometimes even that feeling, right? Like when that is showing up, like how is that serving you? Like what's the workability with that? And
Mhm.
if it's not serving you, like, okay, then what needs to happen? So we work on that. Another process is called self as context, which is this very interesting experience of being aware of your experience in the moment without being attached to
Mm.
to it.
Mhm.
Um, and so that takes a little bit of practice, and the work that we do around that um, is a little bit more challenging, but it's really interesting. And we bring that in again, like very much through like doing the mindful activities in session. Um, we focus a lot on acceptance, right? Which is the opposite of avoidance. And we're acknowledging our experiences because once we acknowledge them, one, it's forcing us to be present, but two,
Mhm.
then we can work through like whatever is going on. Because if we're just in straight avoidance, then we're not doing the work. Um, and then one of the things that like I know I get super nerdy about is values.
Mhm.
So things that make our life meaningful, that help guide our actions and behaviors, like how do we want to live our life? Like how do we want to treat ourselves? How do we want to treat like other people in our life? What is important to us? And using those values like in service of like the choices that we're making. Um, and then lastly, this piece of committed action.
Mm.
Right, so I tell my clients, like, when we're starting that, it's a very experiential, modality, but also it's very much about taking action. So, like, working on your goals and doing things that are gonna take you towards the sort of person that you want to be, and, like,
Mhm.
bringing all of these things in together. So, throughout treatment, like I was saying, I start with the contacting the present moment and doing some mindfulness work, but really like throughout like a session in our treatment we can kind of like bounce around and like
Mhm.
go to any of these processes at any time. That it's not super structured, it doesn't have to be locked in, like that everyone's treatment is going to play out just like
Mhm.
this. So depending on where my client is at when they show up, like that's where we start. So um, it makes it really nice that we're working on psychological flexibility while also like the model itself is very flexible, which I think
Yeah.
there's, something to be said about that too.
Absolutely, and that might be part of why EMDR was difficult, because I know that was my, issue as well, was it's such a
Hmm.
protocol of, like, step by step by step by step and timelines and this and that, that it just wasn't as fluid for me, and so it
Hmm.
sounds like this is a much better fit for how you work as well, because you can sort of move back and forth, and it sounds like ultimately too, what you're helping clients do is sort of separate the thought from themselves a little bit.
Hmm.
Because a lot
Hmm.
of times people I've heard a lot of clients say like, "Ugh, I thought this, like, I'm such a bad person," or "I felt this," or "I did this," and, like, "That is so mean. I'm such a bad person." Like, it just is it
Hmm.
becomes who they are. So it sounds like a lot
Yep.
of this model, from what I'm understanding, is, like, pulling the thought away and, like, really figuring out what it
Hmm.
is, why it is, like, how it's
Hmm.
showing up, and even just, like, giving it the space to, like, "Okay, it's here. Now what are we gonna do with it?" Instead of
Yeah.
spiraling into maybe the
Yeah.
effects of it. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure, right? A
Okay.
lot of times what my clients will kind of come up with is that like it's like the not good enough, right? Like the
Mhm.
not good enough story is really a lot of times what it boils down to. And so recognizing like how that weaves into a lot of their life, and it's like, okay, like we know that this story is going to show up, like we can't necessarily get rid of it, but
Mm-hmm.
like how are we going to like work with that? Like if we know that it's going to be there, like how are we going to work with that? And one of the things that I didn't mention, because it's not necessarily like a core process within acceptance and commitment therapy, but like this piece of self-compassion.
Mm,
I think, as therapists, we talk a lot about like self-care, which is great, but like self-compassion is also huge. And I don't necessarily think that that comes forward as much. But in the ACT world, like there is this huge piece of self-compassion that comes into play. And so, recognizing like when those thoughts are showing up and like how are we going to respond to them? What are we going to do with that? Like also bringing in this big piece of self-compassion work too. Like,
mm-hmm.
yeah. So,
Yeah,
mhm,
which I think is so needed because, like you said, with anxiety, there's a lot of avoidance, but even within that avoidance, you're avoiding it because you've already labeled it as something bad.
mhm, yes,
So,
yes, exactly, right? And part of mindfulness is that we're looking at things without judgment. Easier said than done, but when we're labeling feelings, thoughts,
mhm,
et cetera, as like good and bad versus like that's just a thought. Like they're just words, and we attach things to them. So
yeah.
it's like that's some of the diffusion that we do with that is like lessening the attachment to that. So yeah.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense.
Mhm.
So, why do you think this modality in particular would be helpful for clients, but then also for therapists to learn and use?
Yeah, so I think it would be helpful for clients because I I think a lot of times there's a piece of like, if it's quote unquote bad, like we have to get rid of it.
Mhm.
And that's not necessarily the case because we can't continue that cycle of avoidance. Like, we're not going to get rid of it. Maybe like it doesn't show up as often, but if our only way of dealing with something is just by like avoiding it or, constantly, mm, I guess like restructuring the thought of, like changing it up into like something else, like that's not always helpful. So I think it's just a really nice way to like bring in some other elements that we don't necessarily, we as therapists, like don't necessarily think about. Like I was telling you, like with the values work.
Yeah.
I know before doing act work, like I was not doing a whole lot of that. I was like, what? I don't even know. Like, what? Oh, okay, well, that makes sense. Like, after I
Yeah.
was like I learned about it, I was like, "That makes sense, right?" And you
Mhm.
might be doing some of it, but you may not be labeling it necessarily as values work, but I think it's also really different for clients too.
Mhm.
Because a lot of times when I'm seeing clients and I introduce values work, like a lot of times they're thinking of values as goals, or they're thinking of values as like, oh, my family is the most important thing, or,
Yeah.
my work is the most important thing. And I'm like, okay, that's great. And like, that's not necessarily like a value either. And so
Mhm.
we do some like a lot of like psychoeducation around like what are values and we do a lot of activities around what are values too. So I think it just gives a different spin on things, which I appreciate. So yeah. And for therapists, I think, if you're looking for something, like you were saying, like a little bit more like flexible, like
Mhm.
there's some like fluidity there. There are a ton of different modalities and great modalities. I think a lot of times it's just like finding what fits for you.
Yeah.
And if you kind of know for yourself that um that structure piece is not as helpful for you, you know, try leaning into something like this that offers a little bit of that like fluidity. But I think it's just kind of like figuring out like really what works for you, and trying different things on. And I remember being early on in my like therapy process, and it was like, oh, I'm pretty like eclectic and like pieces from here and pieces from there, which is like okay.
Yeah.
It served a purpose at the time, and, do I think I was maybe doing my best work? Like, I don't know, and that's okay, like, I'm cool with that, but when I found this, I was like, "Yes, and this fits me." I kind of equate it almost to, like, for some of us, like when we went away to school, right, to college, and like you get to college and they talk about like, oh, you just have that feel like you walk onto campus and you have that feeling like you just know. I
Mm-hmm.
feel like I had this very interesting interaction like when I started doing act work and like really getting into it. And I was like, well, this just fits. Like
Yeah.
this just feels right.
It's like dating,
Yeah.
right?
Mm.
Where you're like, that one's cool, but like not a good fit for me.
Yeah, yeah,
Or
yeah.
that
This is
one,
temporary.
uh-huh, yep, no thanks.
Mhm.
So, and yeah, and then you get to this when you're like, okay, I could see a future with you, act. So like,
Mhm.
might be in it for the long
Yes,
haul. So
yes, exactly,
yeah.
exactly.
And I think
Mhm,
that's a good point though, because I think a lot of therapists come out of grad school and it's almost like I don't know that anybody's ever asked me, what is your modality you practice with? Clients,
mm,
jobs? I don't but that's like a question you almost feel like you have to know coming out of grad school. What modality do you
mhm,
work with? And and it's usually like either the culture of the school or it's therapists feeling like they need to fill that identity up. So having a
mhm,
modality is like a piece of doing that. And it's like,
mhm.
but you haven't even had the experiences yet to know what fully works for you or not. You're not supposed to know all the way.
Yeah,
So I think, like you said, a
yeah,
lot of people are eclectic, where it's like, well, I just learned all of these different theories, or I just read about these different, whatever. I took this
mhm.
one training or went to this one conference and they talked about all these things. And then you just have to sort of try that stuff on until you really figure out what you love and, like you said, what fits. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
And kind of along those same lines, because I know you said that you do coaching with
Mhm.
therapists, business owners and stuff like that. So, how do you apply ACT to coaching?
Yeah. Okay, so great question. So really I take a lot of the same core processes and I just kind of do it with my coaching clients. So like I was talking about at the very beginning, like for us introverted, like solo practice folks, we were not taught in school like how to be business owners, right? Like, and
Mhm.
it's much more than, oh, I'm just gonna show up and like do my work and like see my clients. Like, there's so much more behind it. So especially with my introverted coaching clients, right? Like it's a lot of like mindset stuff, it's a lot of like marketing stuff. And so what ends up happening is that we use the mindfulness piece,
Mm,
right? Like we use the values, like those things come into play, like taking committed action towards things, right? So like we're looking at like what is showing up and how do we like work through this and take action based on like what those values are, like you don't have to do it like so and so is doing it over there, like what works for you, what feels good for you, and like how can you also maybe even expand your comfort zone, because it's all like for introverted folks, right? Like we're like good over here in our comfort zone, we like to be here, like it feels nice to us.
yeah.
And having a business, like, it also is going to require you at times to kind of, like, step outside of that,
Mhm.
and that can be really uncomfortable, right? So, like, avoidance, right? Like, that can be really uncomfortable, and if being a business owner is important to you and is something that, like, you wanna do, like, in service of this, like, what needs to happen? So it's a lot of, like, mindset stuff that is actually kind of what's going on. So, again, like, just being aware of what's showing up, like, when you're sitting down to do some marketing or quote unquote like selling yourself or whatnot,
Mhm.
like what's showing up for you and being mindful and like noticing that and like how are we working through that. So it translates really nicely um, to all of it really. And something that was really helpful for me that I didn't discover until I don't know, maybe like 2 years ago or so, is a book called Act on Your Business.
Mm,
And it's by Lee Shea McDonough, who was, I believe she was a social worker
mm,
and is now a coach. And she was primarily an ACT therapist. And so she talks about like using the core processes through like with your business and being a business owner. And of course, when I read it, I was like, "Bing, this makes so much
Yeah.
sense." Like, so much sense. Um, so I was like, "Ugh, in love, in love." Yeah.
That's
Mhm.
awesome. Yeah, because as you were talking, even when you were describing like finding the things that fit, I'm like, that would be something amazing to go through with coaching because how many people are forming these businesses with no real knowledge, but the therapy side of things, going,
Mhm.
okay, well, I'll just like file paperwork and I'll just start seeing clients, but not understanding even like the conversations you have to have with clients sometimes as a business owner, the money mindset stuff, like all of these things that can come up. And I mean, I've heard of people like avoiding their notes for weeks on end or getting
Mhm.
so overwhelmed or like you said, the
Mhm.
marketing piece especially and networking and all these different things that they've maybe never had to do and have no training on. But if their mindset's not right, it kind of doesn't even matter how much training you have unless you're
Yeah.
in the right space to navigate all of the internal stuff with it.
Yeah. And I think because the business world is like primarily geared towards like extroverted folks, or at least like that's what we see, right? Like the
Mhm.
extroverted folks are like they're out here thriving because they're, like their skill set is a little bit different. But for introverted folks, we have an amazing like we have some great superpowers.
Mhm.
And I talk about that a lot too. But like, you know, we see that and like a lot of times there's this like comparison that happens, right? And again with the mindset stuff, like,
Mhm.
oh, like so and so over there is like showing up on Instagram like doing lives all the time and like talking about this and doing that or like raising their rates or like whatever it might be. There's like so much like the imposter syndrome, the comparisons, the
Yeah.
self-doubt stuff that shows up. And so again it's like being able to like work through that and just recognize it and how do we go forward with something that feels aligned and authentic to who we are.
Yeah, absolutely. Because
Mhm.
otherwise the business won't be sustainable. So
Mhm.
yeah,
Mhm.
that makes a lot of
Yeah.
sense, and
Yeah.
that's cool. I'll link that book below that you mentioned because it sounds like that would be really helpful for a lot of people actually, even those just considering
Yeah.
getting into the private practice
Mm.
sector. But
Yeah.
well, I feel like you've already given us like a lot of tips today on some different things, whether it's like looking at your values, looking at mindset, being able to separate the thought, like a lot about like a really good overview on ACT in general,
Yeah.
because I had no clue what it was or what it entails. So I love the flexibility of it. And I feel like seems like it's a lot of like getting to the root type stuff on
Mhm.
top of developing the skills to handle these
Mhm.
situations. So it's a really good balance. So with all of that, is there any other tips or advice or suggestions or anything that you would give new therapists related
Oh
to
my
that
gosh.
or not?
There are some really great resources out there. So if you're interested in acceptance and commitment therapy, I highly suggest checking out man, anything by Russ Harris. He is great. He has a group on Facebook, Act Made Simple, and it's the name of the book that he has as well.
Mm,
He's got some other books too called The Happiness Trap, which is a really great book. And a lot of times I will recommend that for clients. It's an easy read that it's for therapists and clients, and there's not a lot of like jargon in
oh,
there.
nice.
And if you're doing ACT work, it kind of follows along with exactly what you would almost be doing in session too.
Mhm.
So like the exercises and things like that. So it's really nice.
Yeah.
But his Facebook group is amazing. Russ is in there all the time, like interacting with folks, like helping folks out. I think earlier this morning he posted like a free guide for doing ACT work um, with neurodivergent
Oh,
folks and things like that. So he's always like giving, and there's no drama in that Facebook group
oh,
either.
that's nice.
Um, yes, right. So I always enjoy like hands down one of the best groups. He also does some CEU work through PsychWire. It's self-paced, but it is amazing. He does a great job of incorporating tons of worksheets
Mm,
that you can use with clients and like short video clips and things like that. So you can get a ton of CEUs by going through that program. And he has a couple like different ones, but I've done a few, highly recommend. So I'll definitely give you the information for that too. But
Yeah.
that's a good, like, overall, I feel like the best place to start with like any of those resources if you're really interested.
Yeah. And I think
Hmm.
that that makes sense. I think it's nice that there's like different levels of help, whether it's like, here's a big training, here's books, here you can kind of figure
Yeah.
out what works best for you. The Facebook group, like there's different levels of support, and that's
So
helpful.
good. Yeah. So good. That Facebook group is so good. Highly
And
recommend
rare. It sounds like with no drama.
it.
Shocking. Sounds to me like a lot of people are practicing these skills, and that's rare too. But
Hmm. Hmm.
oh, well, thank you so much for being here today and taking the time out to talk to us about all of this and sharing these resources. The happiness trap is actually one that I've heard of. So I might need to get
Oh,
that one then and add it to
yes.
this bookshelf. But and read it too.
Yes.
Unlike some of these. But yeah, so as far as where people can find you, I know that you've been active on Instagram. I'm going to link your stuff below. Your website link. It sounds like you got a lot of good stuff. And I know personally you have a lot of good stuff going on. So I highly recommend you guys follow Laura on Instagram. Yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you. Yeah, check out the website. Follow me on Instagram. We have a good time. You'll probably see Sam pop up in some of those stories and other things.
Yes.
So yeah, we have a good time together. And I give tons of tips about like networking and like marketing stuff and some mindset stuff, especially when it comes to well, mainly introverts, but
Yeah,
not you can use those and you don't necessarily have to be like a business owner or entrepreneur. Like if you're an introverted person in therapy world, like still totally useful.
absolutely. Yeah. And even as you were saying that, I was thinking that there's some people who might be extroverts until they get into this new space. And then suddenly they're introverted because they're nervous and they're new. And so, yeah, I think anybody could benefit from some extra support and tips for that because it's a lot. But thank you so much again for being here today.
Yeah, I had a lot of fun. I enjoyed it.
Yay. Well, for you guys, if you want to stay on top of future episodes and other things we got going on, then go ahead and subscribe below, follow Laura's stuff, and I will see you next time. Thanks, guys. Bye.
Bye.